Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Dr. Brian Besong. Dr. Besong has written on various issues in ethics, and he's also written an introduction to the natural law approach to ethics, so we're going to be discussing that today. Also, I remembered I should have called him Brian, because that's, he's not really too big on being called Dr. Besong. So, Brian, thank you so much for coming onto the show. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks. It's my pleasure, Swan. My current research is in ethics, as you mentioned, and I came to natural law in terms of normative theory relatively late. I had no exposure to it as an undergrad, so it was really, for me, the introduction that you mentioned was part of trying to reconstruct a project that, in my mind, has been lost to Western intellectuals and philosophers in particular. In many ways, I find the theory captivating, interesting, and I wish that more people, especially outside of Catholic moral theorizing in particular, I wish that more people knew about it. Fortunately, many Catholics have heard about it, although it's sort of it has changed because there's the new natural law theory, and so many Catholics that are familiar with natural law are more familiar with the new theory than with the classical tradition.
Well, so let's just dive right into the question of what is natural law theory, and what metaphysical commitments should people be aware of if they're going to dive into, let's say, classical as opposed to new natural law.
Right. And this is the big point of contention between new natural law and classical natural law. But let me start a little bit back, because for those people who are watching who have maybe asking the question, what is natural law theory in general, and maybe have heard of neither the classical nor the new. In my mind, natural law theory is the theory that in order for an action to be good, it should actually contribute to a person's happiness, where happiness is understood as something genuine and objective, not something like, for those people who are familiar with, say, utilitarianism, you'll see Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill talk about happiness, and you might think, well, it sounds like natural law is just another utilitarianism, contributing to happiness. That sounds like what John Stuart Mill has to say, or Jeremy Bentham, or other early utilitarians. But the utilitarian tradition has commonly seen human happiness as being hedonically measured. It's about pleasure. And so natural law, in contrast, sees human happiness as being a much richer and more robust thing. In contemporary discussions about human welfare and human well-being, there are a variety of approaches that have some following. There is this hedonic view that human happiness is measured by pleasure. There is a preference-based view, according to which to have a good life is to have your preferences satisfied. And then there's another view that's known as the objective list theories. And so commonly these are just sort of objective lists. To be happy, you need to tick off the following, let's say, 7 items. Natural law tradition, the classical natural law tradition, is going to be closer to the last of those 3. And so the idea that an action is good if it contributes to happiness is going to be saying something much more like an action is good if it contributes to the following objective measures of what makes for a good human life. Now, I want to be kind of airy at first, because especially if people who have never heard of natural law, I don't want them to get too bogged down into the details. But since we've mentioned new natural law and the classical tradition, this is a useful point of dividing those 2 theories and saying something in favor of the classical theory. So the new natural law tradition was developed since around the 1950s and 60s by especially Germain Grisez, who was looking for a natural law theory that would solve some of the issues that people saw in the classical theory. And the particular issue that he thought was the most pressing against classical natural law was the objection that classical natural law fell afoul of Hume's fact-value distinction. And so Germain Griset and those who followed this new natural law approach took much more of this idea that there are these objective, in some sense, listable features of what make for a good human life. And so good actions are those that respect and never eliminate or never attack these particular basic human goods. But beyond the list, new natural law theory doesn't say much about why these things in particular. They take it as almost a brute fact of human practical rationality that we have to respect. For instance, marriage, among other human goods. And so that new natural law approach is similar to classical natural law in terms of how it sees human happiness, and like what particular things are constitutive of human happiness. But classical natural law, I think, goes deeper than the new natural law approach by adding a metaphysical account to why these objective goods and not those. And so in this respect, I think that the classical natural law tradition is superior both to contemporary approaches to human welfare, which again just often posit various basic goods or objective things as part of a list of what makes for a good human life, and also the new natural law approach. And the reason why is because the classical natural law tradition says that human nature has drives, it has appetites, inclinations towards particular goods. And it's these drives, these inclinations, and the satisfaction of those in particular that make sense of why these particular goods are constitutive of a good life and not these others. So for instance, we could take it as a commonplace that dogs don't need to play chess or to have good conversation in order to live good dog lives. Whereas human beings need some rational pursuits and rational satisfaction if we're to be happy. Now, the new natural law approach or an objectivist theory could just say, and that's just a brute fact about us. But the classical natural law tradition can add, it's not a brute fact about us, it's a fact that's easily explained by natural drives, the inclinations to which we can see in are finding these particular goods attractive, but it's not just a just sort of arbitrary list or an ad hoc list. So the classical tradition says that it's not just achieving certain goods that make actions good, rather it's using our natural powers in their natural ways, or pursuing and satisfying our natural appetites. And it's that in particular that leads to human happiness. And that's why we have to respect those natural appetites as being morally important.
Yeah, that's really good. So, when Aristotle and Aquinas talk about happiness or eudaimonia, right, they're not talking about, right, the hedonistic kind of happiness that we're so familiar with. It's, some people substitute that word with flourishing.
Right.
So could you talk about kind of these natural powers, what are they, and, what are they grounded in? We could talk about essences and natures and so forth.
Yeah. So, and this gets at a question you had asked previously. What are the metaphysical commitments of natural law theory? For new natural law, there's not much metaphysical commitment. The classical tradition, I feel like, improves upon that because the metaphysical commitments explain the elements that might otherwise be something arbitrary. So I think the best, part of me wants to punt to metaphysicians and to say, look, they're going to provide us the best account of human powers and human essences, and I'll just take these for granted as, there's going to be some account of them. But I find the Aristotelian tradition the most promising in terms of explaining what our natural drives are like. So I think, the threefold distinction between the various different types of soul, where we've got a sort of vegetative, nutritive, repetitive, and rational, I think largely covers the gamut of what human nature is like. And it's that human nature with these various drives that um, gives us the appetites. I'm not sure if that, I mean, we could go deeper into that, like what these
Yeah,
powers
yeah.
are.
Well, let me put it like this, because this might actually run into another question. So let's try to, stay as organized as possible, right?
Yeah.
So, in the past, on this channel, I talked to an atheist named Benjamin Watkins from Real Atheology, and when I explained natural law theory, I kind of talked about how one, essence, right, is the proper referent for a being, right?
Okay.
So whenever a being with a nature acts in a particular way, it's to act in a way fitting to its nature, right?
Yeah.
And then, a being's essence is their only proper referent, right? So,
Mhm.
I mean, this kind of gets into teleology if you want to get there, but let me talk about essence being, and then, like there's a convertibility principle, the principle of finality. I don't know if you want to
Mhm.
talk about those at all, but like, that's kind of like what I was thinking about. What are the specifics that are involved in this whole picture?
Right. Um, okay, so there's a few ways to take this. And so I guess the teleology, I guess, is probably the best entry point. So human beings are teleological, and the will itself is aimed at what we rationally see as good. And so all of our choices are often made based on seeing something as better than another thing. Um, but we do this well when we see the particular ends of our choices in reference to the drives of our human nature. And so you're right to say, what we are is human beings. And so the choices that we make are going to be good insofar as they respond to the particularities of our human nature. Now, in some ways, this is too general because, after all, for instance, I've got a rational appetite, and so the truth is one of my aims. And I'm going to do poorly if, as a human being, I aim not for the truth, but for self-aggrandizing delusions. And so I need the truth. It's going to be the truth in particular is going to be what satisfies me, given my rational appetite. But I'm not aiming at the truth in a very abstract way, right? I want to know what the truth is, let's say about ethics, or the truth about where I left my car keys, or the particular truths. And so, I think that this can explain natural law is not trying to posit some sort of very abstract human teleology
Mhm.
and saying, look, you've got to live up to what it means to be this sort of glowing ideal human being. There's variability that's part of the human condition. And so, within some variation, I need to be aiming at the truth. But obviously, for me, the truth about philosophy, let's say, or ethics. For an engineer, it's going to be something different, but it's also going to be the truth. And similarly, there's going to be rational activities or activities that engage our rational powers, but are different for different people. So, for instance, some people enjoy stamp collecting. They enjoy the particular aesthetic features or the novelty. And there's something rational in that that's perfectly acceptable for one person, but it's not going to be suitable for another person. And I would say that both people are pursuing some rational end and can be doing it appropriately, assuming that they're not sort of exaggerating the importance of that. Um, but the reason why we find it satisfying and the reason why we should find it appropriate is because it's responding to something uh, that's a metaphysical part of us, some
Mm.
need that we have for, let's say, beauty or truth. Of course, we can see these. I've sort of alluded to the possibility that someone could exaggerate the importance of these things. So a person who gives up their life in pursuit of a particular rare coin because they just had to have it, this person is not seeing the coin in its proper relationship to human pursuits, human needs. And so that's an exaggeration. And understanding who we are as human beings helps us see how someone could get to take this too far.
Yeah, so just to kind of summarize what you've said, basically under natural law theory, we understand goodness as the fulfillment, right, of some natural power. So when we're doing something, we're actualizing some potential, right?
Yeah.
And when a potential is actualized, it's a potential for something, right? So
Hmm.
like I have the power, right, to pursue, let's say, I mean, you have the power to pursue beauty, I have the power to pursue beauty. But if you actually looked at how we lived our lives, you might find beauty in a piece of artwork. I might find beauty in a song, right? Something like
Right.
that.
That's right.
So then I think the natural segue from this is to talk about then the basic goods. So I
Okay.
mean, a classical natural law theorist can also subscribe to basic goods talk. Is that correct, or?
Okay, so my reservations about basic goods. I've got reservations about basic goods.
Yeah.
Um, because I feel like uh, when I think about basic goods, and I rarely think about them as such because I treat the new natural law tradition as its own thing. And personally, I'm more interested in showing how natural law is a better tradition than, say, consequentialist or
Hmm.
Kantian or even virtue ethics, which I consider to be a rival, because these are the bigger three in contemporary normative discussions. So when I think about basic goods, um, I think that the lists, which vary from new natural lawyer to new natural lawyer, are typically uh, too broad and too ad hoc. And so when I think of it, like I think that the lists are too short. And what's really important to me in evaluating these lists is that new natural law theorists will take these lists of, say, 6 or 7 things, and they'll treat all of these basic goods as incommensurable one with each other. So that means that there is no rational ranking
Mm.
of one good in contrast to another. And any rational ranking they're going to say is, or rather, any ranking is going to be irrational. There can't be, ranking, let's say, marriage above truth or truth above marriage. I think this is wrong. I think that that these lists need to be ranked, and that the basic goods are not incommensurable. Now, insofar as the like, if you just were to say, look, these are pretty good things for human beings, marriage, truth, I'd say, yeah, thumbs up. But when I hear them as basic goods,
Mm.
basic sounds like something like either epistemically basic, like I just have to accept them without any justification, or it sounds metaphysically basic, like some sort of brute fact about human beings. And I think
Mm.
both senses of basic are wrong. It's not epistemically basic. I feel like I discover these goods as some goods among many that I'm naturally inclined towards. And then I also don't think it's metaphysically basic because, as I mentioned before, I feel like the reason why we had these is metaphysically explained by something deeper metaphysically.
Yeah.
Now, I have no problem saying that these are good things for human beings, but once they start coming out as basic goods, I start to
Mm.
like scratch my head and want to describe them in slightly different ways.
Mm. What if someone, so a friend of mine and I, we were actually trying to work on a paper on this very question, and we kind of conceive of basic goods not in that a metaphysical sense or that epistemic sense, but kind of like almost a broad genus of a
Okay.
good, right? So like friendship would have this subset of marriage in it. So marriage would be like a particular instantiation of this power of ours to form a community, to form friendships and relationships, right? So
Uh-huh.
then it's basic just in that sense of being the most general form of that good, and it's kind of like what makes it intelligible from other pursuits. That could be a possibility.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that sounds like a promising approach to them. So for instance, when I think about other things that are good for us, I think about things that are not part of the lists ordinarily.
Yeah.
So like eating. So like that's good for us. I feel like that's a good. Is it a basic good? Well, to be a basic good, when I hear the phrase basic good, I
Yeah.
start to think, incommensurable, never sort of like, it's never justified to sort of eschew these things. You can
Mm.
give up eating for a while.
So you think about like the good, right, or goods that human beings can pursue, and then you don't really need to talk about basic goods, right? But you just rank the
Yeah,
goods of human. I
yeah,
see. Okay, cool.
that's right. And so goods are going to be either things that are the direct objects of our natural appetites, and there's lots of natural appetites. They're going to be the activities of the appetites themselves. That is to say, the sort of enacting of the powers, even if the goal, which again is a good,
Hmm.
isn't actually achieved, but just the exercise of the power can be good. And then sometimes there are sort of indirect objects of the powers, things that are necessary for the power to be successful, and
Hmm.
those are going to be good. So all of those are going to be good,
Yeah.
but I don't think of them as basic goods. That it has too much baggage for me, that phrase, and so I just want to say, like money is good, food is good,
Hmm.
like headphones are good. That these are things that are good. Computers are good. Computers are good to focus narrowly because they are these sort of indirect objects, right? They assist
Mm.
us in the successful pursuit of the direct objects of the appetites.
Yeah. All right. So then, I think this boils into my next question, but I was going to ask you, um, how exactly does natural law theory form, right, a moral theory from talk of the good, right? So where do we get rights, duties, values, virtue from in this theory?
Yeah. Okay. So this is, in my opinion, where the real meat of the theory lies, and as a normative theory.
Hmm.
And so I guess because so few people have been exposed to the theory, one easy way to introduce the theory, like the real meat of the theory, is to compare and contrast it to other big theories that are out there. So I'll start with Kantianism because I consider Kantianism to be one of the most um, plausible normative rivals. And the way that I understand it, there are other ways of understanding Kantianism. For instance, a sort of historical approach to Kant has attacked the ideas that say the various formulas of the universal law, I'm sorry, the formulas of the categorical imperative are genuine tests of the rightness or wrongness of actions. And so I've seen Kant scholars who'll say these aren't tests in the same way that contemporary analytics will take them. But when I read Kant, when I'm trying to find a clear articulation of a moral theory, I find a very strongly deontological theory, um, and one that, for the most part, has plausible implications. I also see left out plausible, I believe that Kantianism leads to implausible results in some cases, and it leaves out an analysis of other cases. It makes it rather difficult. So for instance, I find Kantianism and the deontological approach to be quite plausible when we're thinking about how we interact with human beings and lying. And
Mm.
so natural law, which says that we have these natural appetites which must be respected, is going to say something like this: an action is good insofar as it uses a natural power in its natural way, or uses its natural power towards its natural end, in the way that's appropriate for achieving its natural end, in the right circumstances for the right intention. Now, I think the first part is where a lot of the focus lies, is using the natural powers towards their natural ends. One natural power we have is to communicate. And so, trying to introduce natural law in comparison to Kantianism and some of these other theories, our power of communication is aimed at a goal, namely to reveal what's in our head. And so we are going to be using that power, the power of communication, naturally when we say what's on our mind. It's not to say that we always have to say everything on our mind. It is to say that whenever we're speaking, it should be in harmony with what we believe.
Mm.
Now, so natural law has this deontological component, because you have to, every time you speak, you have to speak in a way that's not in conflict with what you believe. And this is going to be very similar to Kantian deontology. Kant famously opposed to lying even when it saves lives, and natural law at least as it comes through Augustine and Aquinas, is going to say the same thing, that it's intrinsically wrong to lie, because it's always going to be a misuse of the natural power of communication to say something that you don't believe. No matter what the circumstances are, no matter what the intention is, you're going to get the first part wrong, that action part wrong. So natural law has, as a normative theory, has a deeply deontological component. It's going to say that some actions are intrinsically wrong and some are we're sort of duty bound to do. For instance, we are duty bound to pursue our own happiness. That's going to be the core of the core explanation for why any action is good or bad, is whether it helps us achieve happiness or not. We also have duties, deontological duties towards other people. Now, there are some contemporary Thomists, especially who are influenced by Alistair MacIntyre, who have attacked the notion of human rights as moral fiction. And so I disagree fundamentally. I believe that rights are an ineliminable part of moral discourse and moral evaluation. Where do rights come from? Rights are going to be the protections, the moral protections that we have towards those goods and those acts that are part of the natural appetites. A more general way to talk about the rights is that they protect each individual's pursuit of happiness. And so you might talk about them as moral powers. They are powers of morality to pursue the actions and the ends of our natural appetites. And so rights protect what is essential to every human being's successful pursuit. To use a couple of examples, the right to life is fundamental because life is a precondition for the pursuit of happiness. The right of health, right, is another right because to be healthy is not as essential as life for pursuing happiness, but very important. When we're unhealthy, it makes it difficult to be successfully pursuing happiness. We have a right to a just wage. We have a right to a reputation. All of these, a wage, a reputation, these are all constituent parts of successfully pursuing happiness. And so that's why we've got rights to those. We don't have rights in the same sense, the same natural rights sense, to things that, at least in American discourse, we find commonplace. We have no natural right to free speech in the way that we have a natural right to life. That's not to say that a government would do well by repressing speech brutally, because there could be implications for the common good of that society by excessively tyrannical or invasive approaches to speech. But I don't have a right to attack the character of another person, attack their reputation freely, because in doing that, I'm not doing anything that would successfully pursue my happiness. And so I would think of these as some of the rights that we have, or rights that we have based on the Bill of Rights, are going to be something more like positive rights or acquired rights. To be genuine rights and not like a license, they're going to have some derivative, they're going to have to derive somehow from natural rights.
Yeah,
but in
I see
natural
what you're
law,
saying.
we've got these natural rights. And so getting back now to what is natural law, well, Kantianism and natural law also share this deontological understanding about how we interact with other people, because there's an inviolability that rights bring with them. So the inviolability of your life as an innocent person, it's going to be wrong for me in all circumstances, no matter my goal to kill you. And so just as it's always wrong to, let's say, frustrate your power of communication by lying, so it also is going to be wrong to frustrate another person who is innocent's pursuit of happiness by violating their rights. And I think, at least in my impression, the deontological approach to human rights and to how we interact with other people is some of the most attractive, or some of the most attractive elements of a Kantian approach. lots of people are also attracted to consequentialist approaches. And so they see the consequences of our behaviors as having some moral importance. And so there's a sort of kernel of truth there too. And so like consequentialism, natural law is forward-looking. So it considers the circumstances as being another of the three most important parts of what makes an act right or wrong. And so you don't just have to satisfy your natural appetites, but also we know intuitively that sometimes when you satisfy your natural appetites in the wrong circumstances, you're not going to be happy. And since the bottom line is successfully pursuing happiness, doing it in the right circumstances, right? And understanding which circumstances are actually going to be contributing and actually going to be frustrating your pursuit of happiness is going to be very important. And so natural law has this deontological component. It also has a, I don't want to say circumstantialist, but a forward-looking approach where circumstances matter, and intention is also a very important part, which sort of gets at the virtue ethics tradition, which sees the internal parts of human decision-making as being super important. And so building character and acting on the basis of one's good character and the right reasons is a major part of what it means to be a good person. And so these three in natural law are each independently indispensable. They're all part of a package. And I could see the three main theories of normative ethics that have come out of, let's say, 19th and 20th century as themselves being an exaggeration of elements that we already see as part of natural law.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. Like a lot of the theories, they seem like they were aiming at natural law theory, but then, when they went awry, they really just started falling apart. I mean, that's at least my understanding of them. So just real quick, two things, and then we'll get into some applied ethics issues.
Yeah.
One thing that I was thinking about was, let's see here, how you're going to rank the goods of human pursuit. So that'd be something worth discussing. And the second thing is when you talked about ends, circumstance, and intention, could you talk about Aquinas's concept of total perfection in the act?
Yeah, okay, so let's start with the first one. Sorry.
So it's the ranking of the goods.
Yeah, the rankings. Okay, so I consider Aristotle's perspective about the three basic types of soul to correspond pretty well to human nature. There's we've got a rational, we've got an appetitive, and we have a nutritive side. And so I would say that that's our ranking, that rational goods are more central to our happiness than appetitive and nutritive goods. Now, I think that there's an important question to be asked here about why rational goods are more important to us than appetitive and nutritive. Because after all, the contemporary perspective, the hedonist perspective on human welfare is going to say something that is both common to us and animals, namely pleasure, is the bottom line, right? It's the common denominator to welfare. So what is there just a sort of, I don't know, are there excessively cognitive presumptions being made there and saying rational goods are more important? What I would say is that rational goods are more important to us because that power opens to us the door to a vastly larger number of goods. Put differently, it is a more powerful power. It reaches to goods of the future. It reaches to goods of the past, right? We can discover via reason truths of history, right? Truths of the past that are no longer accessible to us in the present moment, and also goods of the future. And so goods about what the world is going to be like 100 years from now. We can, via reason, access goods that are outside of our immediate environment and even the environment that we could pursue, with a lot of aids, right? We're seeing like people, commercial businessmen taking people to the moon and maybe Mars. And so, we can expand our horizons in terms of what is pursuable. But reason expands the horizons almost infinitely. And so it makes accessible a vastly greater range of goods. And for that reason, it should be accorded a pride of place in terms of what is a more significant power, right? It seems like it's going to be more important to us. It's the greatest power that we have, put differently. And so I would say that rational powers should be the highest. And for the same reason, namely the number of goods that are accessible via a power, the appetitive goods, or put differently, the appetitive powers, are going to be ranked lower. So a dog can pursue more than a tree. A dog has more goods available to it than a tree does because it has this power of pursuit. And so those appetitive powers, the sort of more animal side of us, those are also really good, really important, and really necessary. So like I said before, food is good for us. It's also good for a dog. But it's going to be less good than the rational goods. So to touch briefly on the new natural law theory, one of the reasons why I think what their basic goods list is not totally inappropriate is because generally speaking, they're picking rational goods. So they're picking goods that are already at kind of the highest level, and then just focusing on some concrete instances of goods that satisfy our rational part. And so because reason's so important, it kind of makes sense, even though I do think that even those goods could be ranked. So I don't know if that's all you want to talk about in terms of ranking, but one important implication I could add is it's for this reason that getting drunk on natural law moral theory is wrong. And other theories kind of have a hard time explaining why getting drunk or stoned or whatever is morally wrong. Now, a utilitarian could say the hangover is more painful than the pleasure of the drunkenness. So maybe they could say that, but who knows? Maybe in 10 years we'll have a pill that cures the hangover. And so then the utilitarian analysis is going to be a little bit more muddled. And so natural law theory has a very easy explanation here. In getting drunk for the sake of pleasure, a person is over prioritizing a lesser good, namely pleasure, over rational goods. And so they're eliminating, at least temporarily, a higher good for the sake of a lower good. And so that ranking actually has some moral substance to it. It has some implications.
All right, yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with you. And what was it, like when you're talking about the rational, the appetitive, and the vegetative, or the nutritive rather, it reminded me of when Socrates in the Republic is talking about like the well-ordered soul, right?
Yeah.
And he talks about how like the intellect, or the rational, has to be at the top because it kind of organizes everything else in a way.
Right.
And also like human beings, for us, our intellect, our rationality is what is our specific difference from the rest of the animal kingdom, right? So we are the rational animal, in the sense that, like, it's not to deny that other animals have rationality in some sense, but we have it to like a higher degree of perfection, right? And naturally. What do you think about that?
So I want to say that what rational powers involve, that the acts of the intellect involve abstraction and reasoning from abstraction. And I don't think that lower animals, I should say, have the power of abstraction in particular.
Yeah.
I think that requires so I think it's our ability to abstract that allows us to see that we have an immaterial part of us, because I don't think material powers can explain abstraction. And it's also that immaterial part of us that reinforces the belief that we have free will, because we have this at least one power that is not a material power. And so it can't be subject to the conditions, the prior conditions and material constraints of the ordinary physical world. So I don't believe that there's any empirical evidence that animals genuinely abstract. And so I think that their behavior can be explained by sophisticated instincts that generate sort of patterns of behavior, but don't require understanding categories of things in the same way. And so I don't believe that animals, lower animals, just have any degree of reason, because I think the threshold here, the minimum degree, is going to involve the power of abstraction, or at least that potential, right? It's a power, so it doesn't always have to be actualized. And as potentials, they're there even from conception, and so it takes some time for those potentials to see actuality, but that's true of all potentials, right? When I'm sleeping, it's going to take me some time, and I can't just start abstracting right away, right? I need a cup of coffee, and so children don't need coffee, but they need some time too to and so so sorry to hesitate on the animals part, but that's what I want to say there.
Yeah, that's okay. And I mean, like, I think Aristotle talks about too how like some of the lower animals, they have something that seems like rationality, but he doesn't exactly want to say that they're rational. And I can understand that sentiment or where you're coming from. Yeah, certainly.
Right.
Yeah. So
we don't want to say that they're not acting in irrational ways.
Yeah, that's right.
And their instincts are clever and often adaptive, very useful for them. And we have instincts too, but in us, our instincts are often trumped by what we can cognize and think through. And so I think the principle of behavior in us is noticeably different. Although that's not to say that we don't act instinctively. I think intuitions are often sort of cognitive instincts. So we have them too, but we don't act on them as readily.
Oh, so you're talking about kind of like the way in which human beings reason, right? And, with the abstraction and then the acting on the will and then ordering everything else and so forth like that. Yeah.
Right. So we'll see some commonalities between animals and human beings, and we could describe those as quasi-rationality. Obviously, animals are, pretty smart. Otherwise, they would just die. But it's smartness that is different in its mechanics.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the fundamental difference there, is that we're abstracting and thinking about categories of things, and they're not.
All right. Well, then the second question was just about total perfection, if you want to touch on that at all.
Okay. So I'm a Thomist in some sense. All right. But I should mention that my training was almost entirely contemporary analytic philosophy.
Yeah.
So my emphasis going into graduate school and most of my graduate work, most of my research is what I would consider to be historically motivated contemporary philosophy. And so that's not to say I don't want to think about what Aquinas has to say, but it is to say that sometimes I don't feel like I'm as competent a Thomist, and so I want to say what I think is right, and then I think maybe Aquinas usually agrees, and then sometimes I'm making mistakes about what's right, and then I read this in Aquinas, and then I see my mistake. But I feel like that has to be added in because I'm sure that your viewers include people who are more capable Thomists than I am, and so they're going to point out some flaws. And so that disclaimer here, I don't speak Latin, and so I think that disqualifies me as a Thomist straight off.
Oof.
All right, but that said, earlier I mentioned that there are three big components to natural law moral evaluation, and those three components are I sort of consider it the act itself. In Aquinas, he often calls this the object. And then the second is the circumstances and the intention or the end for which you act. And so I mentioned how earlier that natural law is these three parts as all part of the same package. And so if in evaluating activities, we have to see whether each of these is good, that the whole thing needs to be good in order for the action overall to be good. So we evaluate first, is the natural appetite being is a natural power being used in its natural way, which is the sort of fundamental part of a natural appetite? Is it being done in the right circumstances? And is it being done for the right end? It may be useful because, at least when I introduce this notion to students, most students, when they hear, is it done in the right circumstances, suddenly start thinking about, is it being done during the zombie apocalypse? Because zombie apocalypse is a bad set of circumstances for any activity. That's kind of what they think of. When I'm thinking about circumstances, what I'm thinking about are two different questions. The first is, many of our natural appetites or many of our powers require some assistance. In order to be successful, they require some particular indirect objects, I said before, like in the case of the appetite for sustaining ourselves, we need food. And so that food is a sort of indirect object of the appetite of eating, or I don't know, whatever appetite you want to call it. And so the first part of circumstances is, are we supplying to our appetites what is necessary for those appetites to be successful? Or are we intentionally leaving off what is an important ingredient to the successful use of the appetite at that particular moment? And so people who, for instance, my students have told me about a show that I've never watched, but it's called My Strange Addiction. And they did some like really weird stuff, among other, like they'll tell me all sorts of couch cushions and worse.
Yikes.
But a person who's doing that may be activating their power. They're chewing, they're swallowing, that the power is being used in the normal way, but they're not supplying to it the right material. And so in that, maybe the act itself is okay, but there's a part of the act, namely the circumstance, what you might say, that's failing. And so you can see that, okay, look, what I eat is under my control, and when I'm eating couch cushions, I'm doing something that frustrates the appetite. I'm not really using it in the right way towards its goal to make it successful in that moment when I can. And then the second circumstance of relevance is, does the act violate any relevant duty, any duty that I should attend to in these circumstances before the activity I'm engaged in? So if I go to a soup kitchen and I donate time there helping people, which is a great act, but in doing that, I neglect the duties of my state in life, let's say to care for my children, then even though abstractly the act is good, it's actually become bad based on the bad circumstances. So I feel like adding that in is kind of important, because either someone hearing this is going to think, okay, circumstances, that sounds very abstract, or if they try to make it more concrete, it's common, at least to my students, to think about like bad circumstances like zombie apocalypses, or why would all three be significant? Why can't you just get the best 2 out of 3 in order for natural law to appraise that action that's being done as good? The reason why gets at the first explanation of natural law that I gave, namely that in order to be good, an action must actually contribute to human happiness. And we see that as temporally contained creatures, right? Creatures that have to pursue happiness over time via the satisfaction of a changing animal nature that is not going to achieve happiness fully in a single moment. We have to attend to not only our appetites and satisfying those, but the circumstances and the intention. Put differently, it's very intuitive for us to see all three as actually contributing or detracting from how successfully a particular act will lead to happiness. And so we know from just anecdotal experience that I am not going to be successfully happy if I use my natural power in its natural way and neglect something far more significant. in doing that, right? I use my natural power in its natural way, eating some food, and I decide to have that food, my lunch, uh, instead of attending a very important meeting. Now, that's not going to contribute to my happiness. And so, just anecdotally or through personal experience, we see that circumstances matter, the actions themselves matter, and our goals matter. Our goals matter because we're rational beings. And so, part of human happiness is the satisfying of our rational appetites. And so, if we're acting for all the wrong ends and for all the wrong reasons, we are frustrating the rational side of our happiness. And so, it's for this reason that all three components to action evaluation are very important and can't be eliminated. So I don't know if that is that.
Yeah, that's good, because you're basically saying, well, like, basically there's no good excuse, right, to leave out any of these perfections in the act, right?
Right.
Yeah. All right. I mean, I have no opposition. So
You're from the audience, though. I'm trying to think of who's going to be watching this, who's going to be thinking of objections.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, so we can probably get into some objections and some applied ethics issues. Yeah, I mean, we have time. So let me try to divide these into two kind of main questions, right? So we'll do an applied ethics question, and then we'll do an objection question, right? So the applied ethics question, I'm just interested in your take on why are natural law theorists so big on the sanctity of life and the sanctity of marriage? So
Yeah.
let's hit those first.
Okay. So life and marriage, I'll take those in order. Earlier, I mentioned that natural law has this really fundamental deontological component, especially in seeing how we interact with other people. Because other people are also agents pursuing their own happiness. And we see that, like us, their happiness has certain objective components, requirements. And if we frustrate those components or requirements, if we alter their environment, if we do things to them, they're going to be unhappy. And given that we are social creatures, we in turn are going to be frustrated. And so respect for our own happiness, as well as respect for their happiness, requires acting in these socially harmonious ways, respecting other people's rights. Now, rights have limits. So one of the features of a right is that it is limited by other rights and duties. And one easy illustration of this is property. Classically, and within the natural law tradition, as well as within a broader tradition, if it were morally necessary for me to survive, that I steal some food, let's say from a farm or from a grocery store, if it were morally necessary to survive, it's morally permitted. It's not even a true instance of theft in the same way that, let's say someone walks into my house and takes my TV, that's a true instance of theft. They haven't respected my right to property. Well, why the difference there? The natural explanation is that the right to property is limited by other rights and duties. Here, the right to life is in conflict with the right to property. And life is far more significant, it's far more important for the successful pursuit of happiness than is property. Both make contributions, but life makes a contribution that is absolutely essential, and property makes a contribution that's merely helpful. That distinction between essential and helpful also gets at which rights are alienable and which rights are inalienable. So an alienable right is one that you can forfeit, you could give up voluntarily, and it is morally permissible to do so. For instance, although I don't advise it, boxing is a perfectly legitimate pursuit. I think we should be concerned about concussions and long-term impacts, but generally speaking, if I wanted to have some fun, put on some gloves and go in the ring, I can do that, right? And so suppose we're in the ring together and you sock me one pretty good. You've not wronged me, right? Because obviously by getting into the ring together, we have forfeited our rights not to be hit upside the head. And that's perfectly permissible. We can do that. Someone who decides to embrace the religious life can take a vow renouncing their property, right? Renouncing the ability to hold property, period, for the rest of their life, perpetually. So those are alienable rights, the right not to get punched in the face, the right to hold property. And the reason why is because both of these rights are mere contributors, but are not essential contributors to the successful pursuit of happiness for a human being. They do help, but they're not essential. Other rights are inalienable. And so the right to life, I would say, is the best example of an inalienable right. It cannot be morally forfeited because any forfeiture would ultimately frustrate your pursuit of happiness. And since every action has to actually contribute to happiness, some rights, the right to life in particular, could not be forfeited without ultimately and directly frustrating happiness. Now you might think, well, that's just special pleading because the right to life is the only one I've mentioned. Another right that's inalienable is going to be the right to knowledge. I cannot give up my right to know things or to pursue the truth. And so that's good. That doesn't mean I have to exercise it all the time, but I could not morally forfeit the ability to know things or say to myself, like property, I'm going to take a vow of perpetual poverty and ignorance. That the second one does not work. You cannot say poor in mind without moral failings. And so that doesn't mean you have to learn everything. You could choose to pursue some goods at the expense of learning more. But that's not, you're not pushing that off as a good. It's just that you haven't pursued it at the particular moment. If someone said, here's a pill that's going to make you stupid, there could be no morally, if that's all it does, that couldn't be permissible. All right, now why, this is all background, but it kind of illustrates why life is so significant. For the natural law perspective, life is always the most important, or almost always the most important contributor to an individual's pursuit of happiness. So in terms of the ranking of rights, property, for instance, is going to be relatively low. Life is going to be relatively high because property adds to a person's successful pursuit, not that necessary. Often it can be suspended. Life, you die and your pursuit has ended. And so for that reason, of all the rights, it's going to be the most significant. Now, earlier I said, now this might give a reader the impression, or a viewer the impression that this makes all violations of life intrinsically evil. And I don't want to give that impression because, like other rights, even life is limited. And life can be limited by a person's own voluntary choice to pit their life against the common good of a society. And so, at least in terms of sort of purely natural law reasoning, thinking about the death penalty or killing in a just war or killing in self-defense, these are ordinarily instances where a person is limiting their own right to life by, let's say, holding you at gunpoint or killing another person and showing that their will is fixed against the common good. And these are ways that a person can then limit their own right to life, even though life is, on the totem pole, it seems to be the highest. Even then, it can be limited. But assuming that a person has not limited their right to life in that way, assuming that they're innocent, it's always wrong. And so that strong deontological component is there, which makes it always wrong to kill the innocent, because it's always going to be using our social power to frustrate the pursuit of happiness of another. Okay, so that's life. Marriage was also a really significant one. And probably, I think maybe we might talk about this in terms of objections, but one objection that many people have in natural law is its sexual ethics. And so to explain why marriage is so significant, we have to take a step back. We have a power, the sexual power, that's aimed at the good of procreation. Okay, so the sexual power broadly, biologically, right, we see that the parts are fundamentally aimed at bringing about babies. Even often a person's libido is a function of how fertile they are at that particular moment. And so lots of human sexuality is very strongly aimed and clearly aimed at babies. That said, babies are not just one-off products, right? They're not just like, you make them and then you put them on the shelf. They're not widgets that once they are made, they can just be, shuffled off and you've successfully achieved the goal of your power. No, the goal of the power involves more than that, right? We can rationally see that children and procreation is a pursuit that requires a lot more than just Wild Saturday Night. And so making a child is making something that we rationally know requires an emotional, financial investment, an investment of time. And so we can see, earlier I mentioned that one of the circumstances that is necessary for successfully being happy is that you supply to your powers all that's necessary for the power to be successful, to achieve its goals successfully. And in the use of the sexual power, marriage is going to be that component, right? So that the person that you are having sex with, the person that you're procreating with, is a person that you are married to. Now, what is marriage? I would consider marriage to be a friendship of a special type. And so it's a natural relationship, just like friendship is natural. It's nothing specifically religious, although it can take a religious component. But it's a natural relationship of commitment for the sake of children. Okay, or at least it's aimed at that goal. And it's the procreative side of marriage that explains many otherwise puzzling elements of this natural relationship. Why would people consider marriage to be a relationship that should last a long time? I mean, if people aren't on board for a lifetime, most people don't think marriages that last an evening are genuine marriages. They think something conceptual has gone wrong there. Why would it last a really long time? Well, someone might say, well, because it's true love, and true love should last a lifetime. Okay, but why? What if it doesn't? What if it's genuinely felt, and then a person wakes up one morning, 3 mornings later, and they decide, you know what? It's gone. It was true love, but now it's not. And so, okay, saying it's true love doesn't necessarily require lifelong commitment. And so why conceptually would we say, all right, the person who is only married 3 days, that's not even really a marriage anymore. That's just something. Well, the reason why is because we see that children last really long time. And children require this investment. And to be successful, they require an investment that lasts their lifetime, right? People are as traumatized if their parents get a divorce when they're in their 30s or 40s as they are traumatized if the parents get a divorce when they're 4. I mean, maybe the trauma is different. Maybe it's more impactful when they're 4 than 40, but it makes a significant impact on a person's life, happiness, ability to develop relationships later on. For instance, people who are children of divorcees commonly have a harder time having successful marriages later on. And insofar as marriage is an important constituent of human happiness, that pulling the rug out from under them is not helpful. It's not healthy. Okay, so all this said, we see that marriage is an important part of successfully procreating because of the essential and ineliminable role it plays in successful procreation. And so insofar as children are, last a very long time, marriage should last a really long time. Insofar as modeling a a positive relationship requires emotionally investing in each other, the two spouses, making concessions for the other person's needs. Let's say, so I might be an excessively critical person. I shouldn't say maybe. I am an excessively critical person. And so my natural tendency is to, point out, oh, you left this line here, or you left that line there, or you forgot to, do this that I had asked you about earlier. And my wife is a sensitive person. And so, for my children's sake, if not for my wife's, I need to make concessions for her sensitivities, right? And so, maybe the progress isn't as fast as it would be ideal, but that said, my children should see that the critical dad is learning to try to be less critical for the sake of the other person. And that modeling of good behavior and emotional investment requires seeing my spouse as someone that I'm not just with temporarily. When I'm talking about this with students, I'll often make the argument that the central difference between a marriage and a long-term relationship is analogous to the difference between a home owner and a renter. And so renters and people in long-term relationships know that the door is always open in a long-term relationship. You can always leave. And a renter, right? You can always leave. And that changes how you see your environment, right? And your spouse or your significant other. Sometimes people today talk about them as partners, which is just sort of be like gender neutral about durability, etc. And so if you're just seeing this person as a partner, a temporary partner, why go through all the emotional hard work of trying to change your own personality and its excesses for them? Because, hey, you know what? Let's just wait till the children are 15 and then we'll go on our way. And I won't have ever had to make the hard work of changing, who I am, because that's hard. It takes a view of the durability of the relationship in order to make those sorts of emotional changes, the same emotional changes that are so significant for children to see in order to themselves respond adequately to the people around them, in order to not be egotistical and selfish, in order to be successful human beings and happy human beings later on. And so, we could talk more about what it is about marriage, but those are just a few ways in which what a marriage is has natural implications for why it's so necessary, and why in turn it needs protection from threats from the outside. Because just as there's threats to life, there are threats to marriage, aping of marriage, in thinking of long-term relationships as being equivalent, or thinking about relationships that have fundamentally no orientation to procreation as being fundamentally the same thing. Well, all of those are threats to marriage because they imply that the features of marriage which are so significant to the successful procreation are themselves just accessories, dispensable accessories, which are nice to have, but are not really what marriage involves. And so all of these threats need to be protected. And that's why I think especially, in the United States and the West, a lot of discussion about the threats of marriage occur when people see proposed parallels that dispense with what someone who advocates for natural law sees as essential characteristics.
That's beautiful. Like I have nothing in opposition to say to that. Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. Since we're kind of running out of time, let me just get right into this next question, and then okay. So then, when it comes to natural law itself, there are like kind of two kinds of arguments against using nature as the guide, let's say. Yeah. So one is the is-ought fallacy. Are you committing it? Right? They're the fact value distinction. The other one is that, well, look, when you look at nature, you see, chimps rape each other, and right. Sharks, do this and that with each other, whatever, right? Yeah. Some people say, well, nature can't be the guide if we see these terrible features in it. So then fact value, and then is nature good, let's say.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So fact value first. this one's, since we're low on time, I could be quicker with this.
Oh, no, no, no. Like, I was just saying, I was thinking for your sake, right? Because, but if you have the time, then that's totally fine. You know, I just want to make sure, being careful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I am not in a rush. So
okay, cool. So then don't rush for the answer.
But then some people on YouTube are going to have to watch this in double time if they want to keep it to an hour. So
I mean, I've done a 3-hour episode with Rob Coons and everybody, so it's okay.
All right. Well, let's start with the is-ought fallacy. So the first thing to say is that this distinction is extremely controversial in metaphysical discussions. And so, the Humean argument, first of all, it's not even clear that Hume himself endorsed this distinction. But then you might think, historically, who cares, right? Like a good analytic philosopher, I think, well, what historical figures think is not as significant as what I ought to think. And so maybe you want to say, look, Hume didn't advocate it, but he ought to. And so today, some neo-Humean could think, well, this is a super important distinction. It's not really clear what it's grounded in and why someone should advocate for it. And so, I would say that the burden of proof is on the advocate of the distinction. But that said, let's suppose that they provide a really ample justification. I haven't seen it. I'm waiting for it. When I hear it, I can respond to that justification. But let's just assume that they have some justification. What I would say then is that natural law is in no worse a boat than any other normative theory in understanding that the world and morality come together, right? So to use a simple illustration, utilitarianism sees moral facts as importantly connected to non-moral facts. Descriptive facts and evaluative facts are inextricably linked, right? Because the fact of what action contributes more pleasure, which is a descriptive fact, is ineliminable from then evaluating that action as being better or worse. And any moral theory that's worth its salt is going to see the world as playing an important role in helping us to evaluate that this act is good and that act is bad. And so every moral theory has to see connections between evaluative facts and descriptive facts. And so I would say that natural law is in no worse a boat than any other moral theory that sees there's got to be a bridge. Now you might think, well, what justifies that bridge? And that's an important question. I would say epistemically what justifies that bridge is going to be that we have certain fundamental moral intuitions. Those moral intuitions see a bridge. So epistemically, I think they are as solidly grounded as mathematical intuitions and other intuitions that are indispensable. I think philosophy can't be done without intuitions. And so I've seen proposals that try to eliminate intuitions from philosophy, and I find these to be complete non-starters. And so intuitions seem to play an important, indeed ineliminable role across a variety of disciplines. And so I don't see why it should embarrass anyone to say, well, look, we've got these fundamental intuitions linking the descriptive to the non-descriptive or evaluative realms. And maybe the realms are the same realm. I don't care. I don't know. I think probably the same. But even if they're not, I don't think much rides on that. And so anyone who wants to press it very deeply is going to be, I would say, pushed to moral error theories or other views that tend to be more nihilistic about the evaluative realm. But then you start thinking about, you sort of doing your Morean, like G.E. Moore type analysis, right? And you're thinking about, okay, should I be shifting here? If at the end of the day, my advocacy of the is-ought distinction requires me to give up the view that stabbing a young girl is morally wrong, how firm should I really be about this is-ought distinction? Like, am I really justified in taking this that seriously that I could give up on something that's far more obvious to me, that rape is wrong, that the subjection of a whole race to slavery is wrong? Like, these are things that are pretty obvious to me. is the is-ought distinction as obvious? So in the reflective equilibrium that I'm having to do, I'm going to say that those moral intuitions are going to be far more obvious. So then we have to work backwards. There's got to be some bridge. There's got to be some explanation. But then you think, okay, my moral intuitions sometimes make me repelled at what I discover in nature. And so I'll get this in both ways. I think you presented a more plausible version of this, but I once heard Peter Adamson, who has this great podcast on the history of philosophy without any gaps. I love the podcast. But when he tried to talk about natural law, I was just smacking my head because it's so bad. I think if I remember correctly, he was talking about using artificial medications and airplanes as being morally wrong. Right. So, the version that you say is much better. Is nature good? That I think is one side of a more appropriate evaluation of natural law. But then you also get these complete misunderstandings about what natural law requires. And so in both cases, I think it's useful to step back and to say, okay, why is nature significant? Nature is significant in natural law thinking because it's human nature in particular that sets the standards for human happiness. And so we cannot fool ourselves into thinking that human happiness isn't a function of being human, that we're going to be happy or satisfied as human beings by things that are totally opposed to what we are. Okay, so the main role that nature is playing is constraining appropriate understandings of what happiness is. So nature tells us what human happiness is going to be. But then you might think, and this is why I like your version of this better, here's a better objection. Well, look, if we see nature so self-destructive, so cold, as it were, that there's this sort of harsh world out there that doesn't care about me, that doesn't care about human beings. It just cares about, say, the survival of the fittest. Or maybe it doesn't care about anything at all. Maybe nature is totally cold to us. And so if nature is so totally cold, harsh, cruel, malevolent, why should I care so much about my nature? Now, I think that there may be some ambiguity in the term nature between those two uses. So my human nature is, my sort of human characteristics. And in contrast, you could talk about nature as a sort of system of, like let's say an ecological system. Those are two different senses of nature, but you might think they amount to the same thing, that they're the givens, right? The given ecological system, the given human nature. And so why suspect that either of the givens is good, especially if we look out and see that the given world outside of me is not so good? Why then suspect that the given human nature, the given human characteristics are good? Now, I think this is a really useful question, but I think that in order to appropriately appraise the given of the outside world as being cruel, harsh, cold, we have to assume certain, the same assumptions that we're now trying to dismiss. How? Well, specifically, when I see, my colleague loves to watch these nature documentaries where it's like the hunting. He and his son enjoy, seeing the eagle swoop down and eat their really cute lemming. But when I see this, me and my wife are like, I'm very, I'm sensitive to those, eating of cute little furry things. I don't like to watch that. But why not? I mean, this is not to say that the eagle doesn't have its own nature that flourishes via the consumption of extremely cute little things. That said, what am I reacting to? I'm reacting to the failure to flourish of something that I get emotionally invested in, right? And so my appraisal of the given of the outside world is harsh and cruel. What I'm really doing is seeing that some natures aren't flourishing, and that crushes me. I want to see those flourish. I want to see the little cute things I mean, probably they would flourish a little too much, and this is why we need the predators. But at the same time, the reason why I might see the natural world as something to react against, and then to begin to ask questions about my own given nature, it requires certain assumptions, right? Why should I see those? Why should I see nature as cruel and harsh? Unless it's because I see certain natures and I know what it would be for them to flourish. Like, lemmings rolling around in a happy field of flowers, right? I know what it would look like. So seeing in the lemming or the other, cute little furry thing, some nature, which has an inbuilt goal to flourishing and happiness, and then seeing it frustrated, right? That's why I might see nature as not so good. But of course, if you're going to dismiss human nature as misdirected, unhelpful for understanding what human good actions are, well, why then are you going to do the same thing in evaluating what you see in the outside world, right? Why think that the cruel actions that you see, let's say, an animal eating their young in the first days of the young's life, why see that as harsh? Why see that as bad? Unless you see that the young have a nature that can flourish but don't, that are frustrated in the pursuits that they naturally would have gone through.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, so what you're basically saying is, even to make that argument, you need to assume some level of teleology, right? And
Yeah.
that just because you have misfires, if you will, in nature, that doesn't eliminate the teleological character of the acts themselves, right?
Not only does it not
Yeah,
eliminate it,
it
in order to
presupposes.
evaluate it, you have to see the teleology.
That's right.
Yeah, so the appraisals go away when the teleology goes away.
Yeah, so basically you're saying that there is an incompatibility between seeing the harshness of nature and still viewing nature as a guide, but you just can't equivocate with what you mean by nature.
Yeah, I think that's a
Yeah.
good way of putting it. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Brian Besong, I had a great time today. Thank you so much for coming out on Intellectual Conservatism. Brian, do you want to say anything before we wrap up this episode?
Well, I guess final thoughts. I love natural law, so I'm very appreciative of you running an episode on this, because, in my opinion, more attention needs to be paid to this tradition, especially in circles that have sort of dismissed this. Contemporary analytic normative discussions. This is a theory worth taking seriously, and so I hope that your episode and other contemporary discussions will draw attention to it. So that it's not just the big three, but the natural law will reemerge as a serious normative theory.
Yeah, just if I can say some of my final thoughts too, because this is an area that I love deeply. Because actually my entrance to Thomism was through ethics, not necessarily through metaphysics, right?
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, one thing that I just noticed is that in class, when I'd listen to people talk about different problems in ethics or meta ethics, I just started realizing, like, wow, like for me as a Thomist, I didn't see a lot of those problems, or I had the resources to reconcile them. And also,
Right.
as you talked about, like how natural law theory unifies all the theories together and takes the best of each part. That's
Right.
something I think really significant in the theory. And then finally, I guess, like, I made a Thomistic moral argument for God's existence and published it on Moral Apologetics. And when I wrote that argument, when I was doing the research, I noticed that almost every single kind of moral theory that had any weight to it all had some element of natural law embedded in it or borrowed it, right, from the traditions.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So then, like, I just started noticing, like, yeah, this is pretty plausible, and
The farther that a theory goes from natural law, it seems like the farther it goes from plausibility.
yeah, that's right.
Like we even get in contemporary virtue ethics, eudaimonistic views of what virtues amount to, which are pretty much natural law without as much systemization.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it just, here's a better explanation of eudaimonia: the natural appetites being satisfied. And this is also going to give you a super systematic and analytic set of tools for evaluating every action. So yeah, I think you're right. The closer they get back to natural law, the better they get.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for coming, for you joining me on this episode today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Juan.